Welcome back, guys. Let's do a review of the Canon R7 for wildlife. If you haven't caught that video last week about the rabbit videography, a little bit of photography first impressions, you can go check it out. But we're gonna, I've had this camera now for about a month and kind of running it through its paces, kind of getting a feel for some of the strengths, some of the weaknesses, and some things that are just okay. So let's dive into this, some of the things that I really like about this camera and that. So first off is the EVF. The EVF, you look at the technical specs, it doesn't really sound anything outstanding, but I really like the EVF. I think it's very clean, it looks bright, it looks crisp. Yeah, you can do a pretty good job on that. The 32 megapixels, the sensor in here, it's not a huge bump in improvement in resolution over your 24 megapixels, but it is somewhat noticeable. And I think that can be added into the pros little column there to help you out. The RAW is going to be your friend with this. I'll mention the JPEG, but if you're a RAW shooter, all the much better. You're going to be able to eke out that 32 megapixel performance on this sensor and that. The other thing that I was surprised is the eye autofocus. It works extremely well. An example, the animal eye autofocus seems to work with any lens, unlike the Sonys and some of the other brands where you have to use their native glass for this to be active. You can actually use just, Sigma brand, whatever it is, adapted lenses. The eye autofocus, the tracking works really, really well in good light. We'll talk about the not so good light aspect of it, but just know that if you're looking at adaptive lenses or even like an f11, it tracks the subject pretty well. It grabs that eye, no problem, and you should be pretty happy with that aspect. JPEG Buffer. It's actually really, really large. That was one of the things I was worried about because the Canon 90D, the DSLR, was like 40 or 50 or 60. You had to kind of use it and back off if you're doing 10 frames a second. This is kind of like the Nikon D500. It has a ton of bandwidth or buffer size that you can really hammer it on. And I probably put 200 JPEGs through this thing, full, fine, and it kept on going. So no limitations, which is nice. And that's kind of the whole setup they really thought through, because if you look at the Sony a7R4, 61 megapixels, but when you hammer on the trigger, you're probably getting like 50 or 60 and then it starts locking up. This is pretty nicely thought out to where you have 32 megapixels in addition to probably a couple hundred JPEG in the buffer. Yeah, they took the time and effort to actually put in some actual decent hardware on the back end for the data rates in that. Speaking of the data rates, frames per second, you're not going to be, it's like 10, 20, it is a lot. You're going to blaze through cards pretty quick, but just know, the electronic shutter, which I really like, it's very silent in this camera. There's one downside to the silent shutter, the electronic shutter, but the regular mechanical shutter is nice, but the electronic shutter, to me, that's where it's at. It makes zero noise, and that's a nice benefit because Canon in the past has actually made it like a single shot, or they've pulled some shenanigans on the cheaper cameras and that. And speaking of cheaper cameras, this is $1,499 with just body only. The kit lens, I think, is $2,000 or something like that. But if you look at it in the bigger picture, it sounds like a lot of money. But the Canon 90D is, I think, $1,299, and the Canon R5 is probably $3,800, and the R6 is around $2,500. So it fits way on the bottom end. You could actually pick up this, two of these, and a lens for the price of the R5. Obviously, there's differences in performance, which we'll get into, but just know that, yeah, it's fairly affordable in comparison to that. And if you look at the image quality or some of the video, most of this was just right out of the box, handheld image stabilization. When you look at the video, that was me hand-holding 1260 millimeters, because that's what this is, this 800 mil. Lens with this camera setup's about 1280 millimeters, f11, and there's ways to stabilize it. I could have used a tripod. I just want to give you guys some rough indication of what you're going to see. I have fairly steady hands, but yeah, when you're reaching out that far, you're going to get the jitters. But if you've ever seen this, in-body stabilization is pretty good. It's a little bit behind the R5 and R6. It's very comparable to the Panasonics and the Olympuses. It's pretty nice. It's better than the Sony like a6600 and the Sony a7R4. It's much more refined than that, just to let you guys know where it kind of falls in. But that's definitely an advantage to the R7, is that you're able to get things somewhat smooth. So ergonomics, pretty nice. I actually like the ergonomics of this camera. It's got a little, instead of the big dial, the dial button back here, it's up here. It's easily accessible by the thumb. You don't have to kind of pull off your hand. So ergonomics, I'd say, is a win. I kind of like it a little bit more than most of the Canon cameras. I know some people will probably disagree, the real hardcore Canon guys, but for me, it feels totally acceptable. No disadvantages there. So the sensor, 32 megapixels. This is one of the areas where the Canon is just kind of okay. The follow-on or the previous model, the 90D, I kind of feel like it's the same tech, where the images and the JPEGs are a little bit on the soft side. You kind of need to refine it and you need to sharpen it up. I removed the noise reduction in the camera just so it doesn't affect that. And you can kind of see the noise kind of pop up, which we'll get to in a moment. But I think that's the premise, that they didn't want to kind of make it a little bit of a sharper image because some of this stuff might rear its ugly head. They're going to let you, the photographer, do that modification. Resolution-wise, compared to a 24 megapixel camera, yes, there's more there. You just got to kind of tweak it, sharpen it up a little bit, and it comes alive. I think if you're a RAW shooter, I think that's where it's going to come alive a little bit better, and it's going to shine a little bit more. Battery life is average. Probably 500-600 photos, probably an hour and 45 minutes of video time, just to give you a rough perspective. You're going to need a couple of them. It's not like the 90D, the Canon, to where it's that DSLR feel, where there's just a lot more electronics. You're powering the EVF in this thing, you're powering the in-body stabilization, so you're going to eat through your battery a little bit quicker, but in comparison to some other cameras, it's actually pretty good, so I'm going to put it in the middle of the pack there. Build quality. Build quality overall, you mentioned the ergonomics, but the build quality is standard, kind of standard run-of-the-mill. Feels like an R5, R6, the body very plasticky, and I'm not really crazy about some of this stuff because some of it feels almost like a throwaway camera, but it's decent. I don't have any reservations of it falling apart, and it feels pretty dust and water resistant to a certain extent, but it's not like outstanding, something that's super robust. But for the price, I don't think, it kind of stands in line there. And I think that's the setup, $1,499 for an APS-C sensor camera. This kind of fits nice into the ecosystem. And there's a little bit of a drawback, but just know you have an 800mm lens that you can get out to 1280 millimeters overall with that APS-C sensor crop, which is amazing, and you need that for bird photography. And I think that's where Canon realized, like their 24 megapixel cameras, the RPs, is a little bit lacking. If you want to do small bird photography, this is another 800mm f5.6. This is a 150 to 600. This is kind of the minimum equipment you need for really small birds. This will get you there, but with some compromises. It's light and it fits on the system. The focus is pretty fast, and it seems to work. There are some drawbacks, but as far as fitting into the ecosystem and the Canon setup, the R7 does, it's much needed, because a lot of the other camera systems, like Sony has it. Obviously, if you go to the Panasonic, they have their brand, the Olympus, and Canon is such a big company. You're kind of like, well, what's taking you so long? And that. So some of the drawbacks. Well, okay, the big one is noise. 32 megapixels is a lot of megapixels, and it kind of transfers over from that 90D Canon, that you can tell. I think they've backed off the sharpening. They've taken a relaxed approach to this and are going to let you kind of modify some things. That being said, this camera, the R7, turns into a little bit different beast when you start putting on adapted lenses, which is kind of a downside. We'll talk about that, but just know, going from this 800mm f11, you're usually shooting at 3200, 6400, and some of the images look kind of noisy. And even in decent light, you're kind of bumping up the ISO. And with this high megapixels, I kind of would have much rather seen almost like the Nikon D500, where I have 20 megapixels, but the noise floor is a little bit lower, because you have these things, and that's kind of the overall setup, which it doesn't really match well. I think Canon is going to go full frame. I think this is just a stepping stone until they get the 50, 60, 80 megapixel cameras where you can crop in and get the 1280 millimeters at 25 and 30 megapixels. I think that's going to come, and essentially this stuff will die off. But right now they kind of need this as a stopgap to kind of fill that hole, because they have nothing really affordable. That being said, 32 megapixels is a little bit much. The noise floor is a little too high, and if you're going to run this, sadly, the native lenses on this, being that Canon is producing the 100 to 400 like f8, the 600 mil f11, and if you go up to something like this lens, an 800 mil Canon old school EF, you're at like 16,000 or something. It's absolutely insane. So they have some obstacles to overcome. You're going to have to probably go ahead and adapt the lenses if you're going to shoot like really early in the morning or after golden hour, where the light's coming down. This lens just will not do it. It's acceptable in golden hour and then like a later morning, but unacceptable before that time. Middle of the day, late morning, golden hour, but after that, you're going to be struggling with the noise level and all that. So get yourself, if that's a deal breaker, get yourself some adapted Canon lenses, or we'll talk about a couple other brands here coming up in a sec. Autofocus in dark light. Now the iAnimal focus is awesome in decent light, but one thing I did notice, someone else mentioned this, brought it up, is the fact that in darker light, even the 90D, I started noticing this when it was getting either really dark or somewhat dark in the mornings or at night, that certain hour just wouldn't pick up the focus, even with these lenses as well. But when you strap on an f11, now you're really talking your light gathering. And that's one of the things I noticed immediately going to this. It was almost like the 90D, where that light and the eye tracking just wouldn't work at certain times. Much more reduced than the R5 and R6. Those cameras focus faster, they're more accurate, and they do it in tougher lighting conditions, which, again, it's understandable. Those cameras are like double the price of this. And just know that if that's a deal breaker, and that's one of the things, bigger lenses, you get more light in, that helps with the autofocus in dim areas, but they're native lenses, they're 100 to 400, 600 and 800 f11s. Again, it's going to make it tougher for you to get those shots with the autofocus and that. So as I mentioned, the autofocus points isn't very wide. There's like this square box, and I think you guys can see on some of the Blue Heron video, you get only so much, and if you move off, you have to watch your autofocus, obviously, but it kind of tells you, in the R5, you get used to it, where you can go way over to the left and just hit it, and then just do your composition and just let it run, and it's constantly tracking. So you get that nice composition of breathing room for the bird in the head or the face, looking off into the distance or with more space. The problem with this is it's a little bit more confined, so you just have to switch off your autofocus. But again, it kind of comes down to the autofocus points and what you can do with it. Video quality options. All right, this was a little bit disappointing, I'll be honest. In comparison to the 90D Canon, I think that had actually more options, and looking at it, if not exact same options, where you have IPB and IPB light, and you have 24, 30, and 60 frames a second, 1080p's up to 120 frames a second, very much like the 90D, but I think there was all eye and there was some other options in the 90D, if I'm correct, where this feels kind of bare bones. In addition to that, there is one benefit, is you can do a super sample. It takes the whole sensor in it, and it gives you a sharper video. And then you can use like the regular crop mode, and then you can use a super crop. Now the super crop I didn't notice, but if you see my video last week on the rabbits, it looked great in the little EVF and on the screen, but when I noticed some of the things were missing sharp focus, because the light, the other item is the the video in itself in super crop mode, which is like 2.5 magnification, puts this around 2000, 2300 or something along those lines. The video looks soft. It looks kind of bad. I don't particularly like the video quality out of the 2.5 super crop mode. And it very similar to the M50 or M200 in 4K, where the M50 and M200 and 1080p is rock solid. It looks awesome. But when you get to the 4K 24 frames a second in those two cameras, it's really soft. It's not a huge high data rate, and the fur and the feathers just doesn't come off all that as well as, let's say, the 1080p, which is surprising. It's just the way they do it, the data rates, and I kind of feel like this is a little bit muddy. The textures feel a little bit muddy in super crop mode, and just a note. So you're gonna have to stick with probably 1280 millimeters versus 2000, and that starts to get into the other competition to where they're able to offer punch-in modes in their video, which to me is better than this, which is surprising because Canon knows how to do their cameras. They know how to situate the price, and what you get is what you get. And we'll talk about that just in a sec here as well. Another one, rolling shutter. I know. So the mechanical is fine. It's loud. The electronic shutter has some rolling shutter issues. It's not the worst I've seen, but just know it can become an issue if you're panning a lot or doing that. I'm very careful with that and don't expect too much out of it, but the rolling shutter is a little bit more than I expected, and that gives you that jello-y look sometimes as well. But it's very, very much there. So the system as a whole, as I mentioned, one of the downsides to this is the fact that I feel that Canon's probably going to go away from the APS-C sensor. This is just a stepping stone, and they haven't built the system as much. Their lenses to kind of support an APS-C sensor format because they're so small aperture, f8, f11. They're light, they're affordable. It makes sense for full frame, but for APS-C, you're going to have to kind of maybe add some things on, which then kind of says, why get into the system if you're going to have to bolt on other lenses outside of that. It's a great camera, don't get me wrong. It's just those type of situations where, yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive if you have to bolt on adapters and use this. Which begs the question then, what other systems out there do I kind of feel hold a candle to this? And there's the the A6500 or A6600 Sony, which with their 150 to 600 can get you out there a ways, and they have some digital teleconverters in body which work amazing, and then they have the teleconverters as well. You have the G9 Panasonic, which I've owned for years, the 100 to 400. I would get the 100 to 400 Olympus. You can get an adapter or just use the digital teleconverter, use like an AI upscale. And so you can get out to 2000, 2200 using 4K, great image stabilization, and the video looks really, really good. To me, it looks better than this, about at the same millimeter distance. Olympus as well. Olympus has their magnification 2 times. I've used it a lot. You keep the ISO low, and it works as well. Again, you buy the Olympus 100 to 400, put it on an Olympus OM1 body or an EM5 Mark III, use a 2 times multiplier, and you're off and running. You have some great options. So they're all comparable. This just isn't as mature as the other brands, and I don't know if it's going to get that maturity there because it seems like they'll be upscaling. So it's a good stopgap. They needed it. I'm looking forward to the future, seeing what Canon will put out in replace of this. Totally usable. It hangs with the other cameras. It just doesn't really surpass the other cameras like I thought it would be. Anyway, guys, that wraps it up. Let me know your comments, questions below, and see you next week.